Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and welcome to the 13th class in my lecture series on understanding contemporary art. Last time we looked at Paul Tech, and before that, Andy Warhol. This time we're going to look at Jean-Michel Basquiat. Now, Basquiat was somewhat of a latecomer to pop art. He came in right about the turn of 1980, and his art occupied a period from about 7 years, from 1980 to 87. He had a short, brief run, but he became very wealthy. And he came in at the tail end of pop art when it was winding down and already becoming highly commodified and commoditized. Money was the thing that mattered now in the art. And so Basquiat came in right at the very tail end of this development. Now, we'll have to define one or two philosophical terms for my interpretation of Basquiat's art. For this, I have borrowed Deleuze and Guattari's term in 1,000 Plateaus for the State, which they define as an apparatus of capture. They call, famously, the state as an apparatus of capture. It's always taking something from you. And I've sort of modified that term and created the term apparatus of semiotic capture to describe any kind of overcoding architectural or cosmological system designed to hold signifiers in place and keep them from running rampant around the culture. During the Middle Ages, in the medieval period, the great apparatus of semiotic capture was, of course, the cathedral, which held all the signifiers in place. And there the signifiers would have been the saints, locked into the various portals and niches and iconotypes on the rose windows and the stained glass and everything. Everything held firmly into place, captured into a single apparatus. And the primary master signifier there was the image of Christ nailed to the cross, which was the master signifier that was the linchpin holding everything in place. So signifiers weren't running rampant around the culture, around the surfaces of inscription of the culture. They were held firmly in place. By the time of the metaphysical age, this changes, and the primary apparatus of semiotic capture during the metaphysical age is Cartesian phase space with its x, y, z axes, and the primary master signifier there is that of the subject, the cogito, the transcendental subject, whose point of view determines everything. And all the signifiers are held into place by the various mathematical systems of infinitesimal calculus and analytical geometry. All those mathematical vectors organize the signifiers and keep them held in place. Now, by the time we get to the post-metaphysical age, one of the main anxieties of our age, and it is the central anxiety of the art of Jean-Michel Basquiat, is the fact that there are no apparatuses of semiotic capture holding the artwork in place and preventing the signifiers from escaping and running rampant around the culture, which they've done ever since the post-World War II epoch. Graffiti generally tended to originate in Philadelphia in the late 60s, right around 1967, and it's an example of signifiers which have escaped capture by the capitalist overcoding. We saw that in the work of Andy Warhol, what he was capturing there with the iconotypes of capitalism, the capitalist iconotypes, and they were sort of free-floating, though. He was capturing those iconotypes, the McDonald's arches or the Coke bottle or the Campbell's soup can, but they were free-floating. And what the art of Basquiat reveals is that there really is no apparatus to hold them all in place. And not only that, there are all these sort of semiotics running around rampant from various internal proletariats of the city, such as street gangs, who have their own semiotic codes, and they go spray painting across the surfaces of inscription of the city itself, inscribing their signifiers, and they're just running rampant. So we have an age without an apparatus of semiotic capture. Now we have an age of signifier overload, and that's what Basquiat is capturing in his art. He started off as a graffiti artist, but he didn't remain that. Here's a picture from 1980 of his early graffiti, which he would always tag with the signature. His signature was Samo, which was, of course, the tag for same old, same old. Here's one, just a simple bit of graffiti. He started off as a graffiti artist, but he very quickly took that graffiti and internalized it and brought it to the inside. Now, one of the central aspects of Basquiat's art is always the relationship between outside and inside. And the thing about his art is, as we look at one of his early paintings here, this is Cadillac Moon from 1981, is that he is simulating graffiti art. And so the conceit of his art is that he is always this graffiti artist standing in front of an abandoned city wall somewhere. So he's always on the outside, and it's as though the city has turned its back to the artist symbolically now and exiled Basquiat, as the contemporary artist generally nowadays has been exiled from the city. Banksy is another example. Basquiat is sort of paving the way for Banksy, and it's turned its back on him. So he's now always on the outside, and there's a central anxiety in Basquiat not only of finding an apparatus of capture to organize the signifier overload, but to try to get back on the inside somewhere. In the metaphysical age, Michelangelo was always on the inside, painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, or Rembrandt in his atelier, painting his paintings for some bourgeois. There's always an inside there. But the artist now is on the outside. And here we see in Cadillac Moon a signifier overload. And these early paintings begin by representing all of this semiotic overload from the city. But very quickly, as we see here in another early painting of his, this one is Untitled Bread Man from 1981, these totemic presences begin to appear. And the red man here on the left side of the painting is the first of these. And you'll note that he's leaning against the right half of the painting where all the city signifiers are sort of pressing against him. And it's as though he were trying to create a bulwark or a dam pushing back against the signifiers, because it's going to be the case that in Basquiat's quest for an apparatus of semiotic capture, he's going to use these sort of shamanic totemic presences as a means of attempting to capture the signifier overload. Here is an example of one of them from this period. This is an Untitled from 1981, where we have this archetypal mythological fisherman, but you'll note that we can see the internal skeleton of the fisherman here, as we can also in this other Untitled from 1981. So we've got this appropriation of the aspect of ancient shamanic art, which is known as the X-ray style, in which the internal anatomy becomes visible of whatever is represented. And here's an Aboriginal art that shows the kind of internal anatomy of X-ray style art. And so it is very much as though in using these totemic presences, they open up and light up from within, because he's going to be concerned with the interior of the human body now. In this self-portrait here of 1982, the interior becomes momentarily opaque in this self-portrait. But what's interesting about it is that the arrow that is held in the left hand here almost functions as an eraser. And you'll note that it's erasing all the city signifieds, or the city signifiers. He's erasing them. And so he's beginning to use the totemic presence as a means for combating the signifier overload of the city. Whereas we had seen in the art of Rothko that there was a battle there. The central battle was that of being asserted against the nothing. And Basquiat's art, it's the sense of the self trying to assert itself against the signifier overload of this capitalist age of information overload that's we're living in now. Here's a self-portrait from 1981, which shows now, it actually shows the reverse now. Here the entire city has been placed on the inside of the skull of this somewhat Aztec-looking mask. It's a self-portrait of him. So all the signifiers have now been swallowed up as an apparatus of semiotic capture. So this is an experiment. It's a tentative finding of the human body lit up from within in shamanic style as an apparatus that can swallow up and hold and capture everything inside of it. Just as in the medieval age, Christ was the mystical body in which all of the cells of his disciples were gathered up on his inside. But the problem is, and here is Untitled Black Skull from 1982, that the signifier overload that goes into the inside of these presences is too much for them and begins to rupture, destructure, and explode them, and they start coming apart into pieces. And you can see here, you've got a bone and an arrow. The central totemic entity is beginning to split apart into a million pieces. And here, the semiotic overload has won the battle already. This is Notary of 1982, in which the city signifiers are running rampant now. The internal anatomy of the central totemic presence has ruptured. We see bits and pieces of the ruptured body of its anatomy floating around amongst the city signifiers here in this painting, which is a portrait of the artist as a young derelict from 1982. You can see bits and pieces of the ruptured anatomy. And so the apparatus fails, the totemic presence fails, and it cannot hold the city signifier overload, which begins to run rampant across the surface of his graffiti images, the abandoned city wall that he's always painting himself, that he's always in the role of painting in front of. And here is a self-portrait, Artist as a Heel, Part 2 from 1982, in which you can see that the signifier, the attempt to engulf and swallow the signifiers has failed. The internal anatomy has ruptured and exploded. And the thing about graffiti art is that it is a collective assemblage of enunciation. There is no single subject of enunciation, as in the artist who creates a novel or a work of art in some sense, and who is the single author. And indeed, this art is created by a single artist as an I, but the problem with Basquiat is that he never managed to find a protective membrane to protect his transcendental self, the subject, to protect it from the overload of the signifiers. Here they are as a sort of disorganized cosmos. This is Luna Park of 1982, running around rampant. And he never managed to create and find a protective membrane that would define inside versus outside. So there are just as many signifiers on the inside as there are on the outside. And so there's a complete failure here to form a protective self, a membrane. and to form, therefore, a subject of enunciation, an I. It's always a collective assemblage. Basquiat is a we. He is always, the point of view is a collective assemblage of enunciation, which is another term from Deleuze and Guattari that defines him as a we, essentially. And here is the last painting I want to show from this series, Jesse, of 1983. And the circle is always, it's the ancient symbol for the self. And here we see the circle with a rupture in the middle of it, but it really doesn't function very well as a membrane at all, because there are just as many signifiers on the inside of the circle as there are on the outside. So the membrane that should protect the self, that should give it a sense of interior versus exterior, has failed here. And there are just as many signifiers on the outside as on the inside. So he's constantly undergoing the signifier bombardment and overload. And the quest to form an inside as a kind of private protective membrane, a little cave, fails in his artwork. And as a result, he's constantly using drugs. He was addicted to heroin during his entire career. And the heroin hollows him out inside and creates a kind of faux interior, a sort of intrauterine, a pseudo-intrauterine state that protects him, tries to protect him from the signifier overload by creating a false interior. But it's only false, and it only lasts for a certain period of time before the overload, the information overload of the self just continues here. And so Basquiat's art really is, his failure to find an apparatus of semiotic capture is the failure of us all in this age of signifier overload to protect ourselves from information overload, which is one of the things that destabilizes the psyche, causes paranoia, spree killings, aggression, all kinds of paranoid conspiracy theories. That kind of thing runs rampant under information overload from electronic bombardment. We're getting signifiers beamed at us from all directions electronically. And so this is the first part of Basquiat's oeuvre, and next we'll look at the second part.